Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We welcome you once again this evening to Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi, on Salam Media. Wonderful being back with you on this beautiful Wednesday evening. The time is just gone, 15 minutes past 7, and we've got a number of issues to discuss this morning with the panel discussions that we normally have on a Wednesday night. Now, in the first hour of the show, we're talking about the huge debate that is taking place with regard to the postponement of the debate on Israel's observer status at the African Union. Now, we've learned about the AU suspending a debate on whether to withdraw Israel's accreditation as an observer to the bloc and avoiding a vote that risks creating what they call an unprecedented rift in the 55 member body. Now, the panel this evening, and we will be joined shortly, hopefully, by Naeem Jina, the director at the Afro Middle East Center. But we also have got Aisha Kaji, who is a senior research fellow at AfriCID. And also, we've got Stanley Cohen, who is an attorney and human rights activist. So, from now right until 8 p.m., we will be focusing on the AU and the postponement on the debate on the Israeli observer status. In the second hour of the show, the plea bargain with regard to the Tulsi twins. And the question we are raising this evening is the plea bargain justified? And we'll be talking with the MRNs, Dr. Ahmed Jesbai and Hanif Hendricks, who is the leader of the Al Jama political party, where we've learned about the Tulsi twins pleading guilty to some what they call terror related charges. So, a lot to come on the show from now right until 9 p.m. But right now, we are going to welcome our panelists this evening. And firstly, we've got Aisha Keji online. Aisha, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome. We appreciate your time with us this evening. Aisha, assalamu alaikum. I think, Aisha, can you hear me? We're going to try and get hold of Aisha. Okay, we are having a slight problem hearing Aisha. I see Stanley Cohen in the background. Stanley, good evening to you and
Alaikum
welcome.
salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yes, okay, Aisha, we can hear you
I can hear
clearly
you,
and
yes.
brilliant. Stanley, good evening to you and welcome.
Good evening to you. It's a pleasure to join you for this wonderful show.
Yes, well, certainly, and obviously a lot to unpack, a lot to talk about with regard to the African Union and the postponement on the debate on the Israeli observer status. Now, Aisha, I just want to start off with you and looking at the suspension of debate, and clearly it has created a lot of discussion, and also at the same time, looking at the AU as a body, as a decision making body, it certainly has raised a few question marks in terms of the summit that had taken place in Addis Ababa.
Yes, absolutely. The AU has a long and proud history of supporting anti colonial struggles like the Palestinian struggle. The Palestinians, as you know, have been very supportive of South Africa's and other African countries' anti colonial struggles as well. So there's been a reciprocal relationship in place there for generations, for decades, dating back to the middle of the last century. And for AU member states to now seek to appease Israel and to appease Israel's allies, particularly the United States, comes as a huge disappointment to the Palestinian people.
Well, it certainly has. And I just want, Stanley, just your initial reaction to this postponement by the AU.
Well, look, independent of whatever the AU is doing, we still have pending before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights our challenge to the process. So obviously, certain members of the AU don't want this resolved because they don't want to have to vote in public in full face about an issue that was arbitrarily taken initially an executive order while the AU was not seated by someone who has a very close and warm working relationship with Israel. So what may have been put off for a year and which a commission will now take a closer look at and which we'll deal with, and is a defeat for Israel, because Israel was expecting a rubber stamp final approval, and next, khalas, they move on and get on with it. The fact of the matter is there is still our litigation, our suit, which is filed against its admission under the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, in which we seek discovery, which we sought, in essence, the relief which was granted, an interim action. Now, I know Israel is typically pounding itself on the chest by saying, well, we've been given, a year to continue doing what we have been able to do. To date, they've been given nothing to do. They've been given, in theory, an opportunity to serve as an observer status, to participate in discussions, to add their 2 cents. But the reality of it is we have no idea what's going to happen with them during the next year. But we do know that we still have pending our suit against the action. And hopefully we expect to have discovery. We expect to have some litigation. It may not happen, but it is certainly part of a broader picture that reminds the AU as a collective body that the notion that individual states may choose to deal with Israel does not substitute for the body politic of an entity that represents all of Africa. So to the degree we heard the executive say, well, there are many of our member states deal with Israel, and what's the difference? The difference is the United Nations, in theory, speaks for the whole world. It doesn't speak for one individual member or 50. It has a body politic to exchange, to debate, to argue, and to move along. This executive decision, in the absence of the AU sitting as a whole, was an outrage.
Thank you for that, Stanley. And I see Naeem Jinnah has joined us. Naeem, if you could unmute your mic. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Yes, Naeem, in fact, we just got started basically, and we've got Aisha Keji, we've got Stanley Cohen as part of the panel this evening, and we welcome you to the show. And getting our initial reaction to the African Union and the postponement. And I'd just like your initial thoughts on this postponement of this debate on Israeli observer status.
Well, let me say that I think that going into the summit, many of us who have been following this closely had a good sense that we will not win revocation of the decision from July last year. What we hoped for, however, was that the idea that the AU sticks to decisions on consensus will be upheld. And so we saw on Sunday morning that that's exactly what happened, that a decision was made to put into place a committee that would deliberate on this issue, and that in the course of the deliberation of that committee, and there was no time frame put to it, as the pro-Israeli lobby is claiming, during the deliberation of the committee, that the decision of July last year accrediting Israel would be suspended. Then we found that within a few hours thereafter, the Israelis started lobbying very heavily, and I put lobbying in quotes because that can mean a whole range of things, so that they forced, in a sense, a debate to take place in the afternoon when there was not supposed to be a debate. A decision was made by consensus in the morning. There was not supposed to have been a debate about it. The debate took place, and a number of heads of state spoke, and then the chairperson of the AU, Macky Sall, declared that the decision of July last year would stand, which means that as we are now, Israel is accredited to the African Union. And I'm sorry, I don't agree with Stanley. This actually has substantive effect and impact. It means that they can attend all opening and closing sessions of AU meetings, which in itself sounds just ceremonial, but it's not, because the most important influence in the AU, we know, doesn't take place in opening and closing sessions or even in the closed sessions, but in the corridors. And Israel being admitted to the corridors is a big step. It's also a big symbolic step for Israel. It's also a very significant victory in that they managed to, in a sense, split the AU, despite the fact that by the end of Sunday, it seemed like, okay, so we've arrived at a decision without having to have a vote. But yes, the AU is split on this issue. It now depends on what the committee, how the committee deliberates. The committee is, of course, 3 versus 3. plus the chairperson of the AU, which is Macky Sall, who it seems from Sunday was more on the pro-Israeli side on this debate. But I think that of the 7 people on that committee, Macky Sall is probably the only person whose mind might change.
Aisha, I noticed that you were nodding your head and when Naeem was talking, and the fact that Naeem mentions with regard to splitting the African Union down the middle, and Macky Sall made the statement saying that the issue can divide us, Africa cannot be divided. But clearly, this speaks volumes, and also looking at the power of the Israeli lobby within the African Union. Aisha? I think there's a slight delay. Aisha, can you hear me?
Absolutely. I totally agree with Naeem and hate to disagree, but have to disagree with Stanley on this issue because, yes, the initial decision was that the Israel's observer status would be suspended. Can you hear me?
Yes, go
Yes.
ahead.
I can hear you perfectly, Inayat.
Yes, go ahead, Aisha.
Inayat, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I think perhaps Aisha
Is my
should
audio coming through, or do you want me to log off and log back on?
Well, Aisha, we can hear you very clearly. In
Okay.
fact, you.
So, as I was saying, I agree with Naeem and I do disagree. Sorry? Okay, lovely. I disagree with Stanley in that I do think this is an important decision.
I think Aisha, if Aisha could just log in and
I
out
can hear.
again, I think we have got a problem, and I'm not too sure whether Aisha is getting some interference with the dogs barking in the background. So possibly that could be confusing Aisha. But Stanley, obviously, Naeem says he disagrees with you on this particular matter. And have you got a comment?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to deign to speak on behalf of the process of the African Union. I have, litigated 2 issues in front of the African Union in the last 7 or 8 years, and what I have found is, on occasion, what appears to be the sun rising is actually the sun setting. So I don't know. My position is I don't see this as a victory for Israel. Yes, Israel, apparently, on the basis of what my brother has just told me, there was a change that they will be able to participate in some level on discussions. I don't know how this is going to play out. Israel had expected the fait accompli. This was done. It was over. We're going to move on. There's now a commission. We will see where it goes. But as I indicated, we still have our claim pending in the commission. The commission may act. It may not act. The commission may permit us to pursue discovery. We've made requests. They may not. It remains to be seen. In any event, in any read, Israel was expecting a slam dunk walk away, an embrace from everyone, and didn't get it. And yes, at the end of the day, certain procedures may have permitted them. And again, I'm not going to present that I'm an expert in the procedural process of the union. My read is the Israeli lobby worked long and hard. They're continuing to work long and hard. In the United States, we've seen some stories and some articles about how we got exactly what we expected to happen. I don't think they did. From a political standpoint, from a propaganda standpoint, and also coming on the heels of the same week as the Amnesty International report and Israel's murder of a 78-year-old Palestinian American citizen, and certain other problems. So, look, Israel can recast it. And as I said, I can't speak for the AU process, but I do believe that we will see how this unfolds over the next 6 months or a year or whatever the time frame is.
Thank you for that. Aisha, are you back with us? Aisha? Naeem, let's continue. As Aisha obviously join us now. I think what is disappointing to note also is to look at the Musa Faki Mohammed, who is the chair of the AU Commission, and he obviously accepted unilaterally the accreditation to the AU, and to the extent that even on Sunday, he defended this decision, claiming that this decision was legal. And in his own words, he said, by granting the observer status to Israel, I acted in full compliance with my prerogatives and powers. Now, what does this actually tell us? How do we read into the statement, Naeem?
Well, he's right and he's wrong. I mean, he's right because the chairperson of the AU Commission has the power to accredit any non-African state. That's clear. He has that power to do so. The part where I say he's wrong is that accreditation or that process obliges him to take a few things into consideration. One of which is the values and principles of the AU as contained in the AU Constitutive Act. Secondly, the values and principles of the AU as contained in the African Charter for Human and on Human and People's Rights. And thirdly, the known views and opinions of member states. Now, the AU Constitutive Act and the Charter are quite clear in the AU's opposition to colonialism and apartheid. The Charter actually goes further and specifies that the African Union is opposed to, and one of its objectives is to defeat Zionism. And in terms of the known views of member states, it's clear that there are a number of member states that would oppose it. Every single meeting where this has come up, there are a number of African member states that have opposed Israel's accreditation to the AU. Also, the kind of strong opposition to Israel's actions. In fact, in May, just 2 months before he accredited Israel, Musa Faki himself issued a very strong statement. May last year was when the attack on Gaza and Jerusalem took place. Musa Faki himself issued a very strong statement on behalf of the African Union. Those kinds of things constitute the known views and opinions of member states, as well as resolutions of the past. But what we also know is that, in a sense, while yes, he did it unilaterally, but in a sense not, because he had the confidence that he had the backing, the full backing, and he was in fact pushed by three member states of the African Union, the DRC, Morocco, and Rwanda, who are the most vocal supporters of him and of the accreditation of Israel. And all three of them in the October meeting and this weekend's meeting put together have said really ridiculous things about Israel's role on the continent and Israel being a friend of Africa and all kinds of other nonsense like that. So he acted knowing that he had the full support of these states. And frankly, he also has his own agenda post-AU that these states would be able to assist him with.
Yes, Aisha, I see you back with us. Aisha, I'm hoping you can hear us clearly now.
I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I think there's a slight delay, and that is the reason why
Inayat, can
we
you
are
hear me?
getting confused.
I can hear you perfectly. There's no delay on my end.
Right, Aisha, just now let's just talk about the Charter of the African Union. And this is absolutely important for us to understand in terms of the human rights violations of Israel, which obviously are contrary to the Charter of the African Union. And particularly when we're talking about decolonization, we're talking about self-determination. And yet, the African Union, by acknowledging Israel, acknowledges the fact that it is illegally occupying Palestine in violation of its international obligations. Now, clearly, this is an indictment. It is an indictment that the fact that this matter has even come to a debate within the African Union, an indictment on the organization itself.
Absolutely. The African Union Charter clearly states its commitment to democracy, to the human rights of all people, and the Charter, the African Charter on Human Rights, which is essentially the foundational document, in addition to the AU Charter, on which the the African Court is based. Also affirms the right to self-determination, the right to people having, equitable and decent living standards, etc., the right of one country not to aggress the other, etc. So in essence, the African Union, in accrediting Israel as an observer to the African Union, is actually going against its own foundational principles, its core values and ethics. And as Naeem said before, the initial decision over the weekend to suspend Israel's observer status while this commission that's been set up does its work and lobbies member states and polls member state opinion, etc. That decision to suspend Israel's observer status was then retracted largely because of behind-the-scenes lobbying, which is why it is so imperative that Israel should not be allowed this, because it is that type of behind-the-scenes lobbying that could change member states' views. For example, the former chairperson Faki himself is a Chadian, and we all know that Chad has significant business interests with Israel as well as with the United States. And it's therefore in the interests of Chad to keep an amicable relationship with Israel, and certainly to appease the United States. The same goes for countries such as Morocco, such as the DRC, and such as Rwanda. And on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, you have those countries that have protested this abuse of the core AU values, including, of course, South Africa, Algeria, and to a lesser extent, Nigeria. But what is also quite shameful, and I don't know if this was mentioned while I was away, but at that impromptu debate that actually happened over the weekend, it was actually quite shameful that the chair of that debate session, Macky Sall of Senegal, who Naeem says is perhaps persuadable, but he was actually putting football before Palestinians' welfare. He kept saying he wanted to get this discussion wound up quickly because of the football happening. And a couple of the other member countries supported that decision. For an African Union session to actually engage in that kind of flummery, really, that kind of base behavior was honestly quite disgusting.
Yes, Aisha. Stanley, just looking at some of the legal options, because we have learned about a group of international lawyers, researchers, activists filing a complaint. And I'd just like to understand from a legal perspective, what legal recourse would there be? Because we've learned even the likes of the MRN, which is the second complainant in this matter, collaborating with people like yourselves. And we see South African lawyers, Nadim Mohammed, Shabnam Mayat, to basically reverse the decision and filing this complaint. Are there any legal avenues?
Well, we're planning on doing a supplemental submission now that there's been this act, which is going to ask for an acceleration of the process. We've not heard from the commission. I must tell you, in preparing the complaint, I took a very close look, an examination of the constitutions of almost all of the member states of the African Union. And it is very clear that the decision by the African Union, in particular by those states that acted as shills for Israel, it is directly antithetical to every single constitution that we researched, both in terms of its intent, both in terms of its application of law. But I must agree with my colleagues on this panel. Israel has insinuated itself so deeply into the military-industrial complex in Africa, has so many private and government contracts for surveillance and for natural resources and for weapons, for billions of dollars of weapon exchanges. I have no doubt that Israel very much acted like bribing, threatening, and cajoling behind the scenes. In terms of legal redress, we plan on supplementing our submission. We plan on seeking interim relief. We plan on asking for additional discovery. We plan on pushing it. It exists as a body which has legal authority. Whether it's going to enforce it, whether it's going to make a decision, I don't know. It's not the first time over the 30 years that I've been litigating international human rights throughout the world that a body ducks its responsibility. It may do it here. It may not. It remains to be seen, but it will not deter us from our obligation as lawyers, as litigators, as researchers, as activists from pursuing our remedies. We have a remedy. We're going to seek it. We're going to enforce it. And we're now going to supplement it. And we think, if anything, the decision by the AU just several days ago makes our argument even stronger. And the commission will either exist as this umbrella entity that seeks in theory, to enforce not just contests within member states of African against one another, but to comply with international law. We'll see. It's not going to stop us. There are remedies. We will pursue them.
Yes, Naeem, clearly there are contradictions when one looks at the African Union in itself. And I just want to talk about the countries that oppose this move. We're talking about South Africa, Algeria, the likes of Nigeria to an extent as well. And South Africa, the argument has been that they have not been properly consulted about this decision. And from now until 2023, because this is now the where this decision has basically been moved to 2023, looking at the countries that are anti-Israel having observer status within the AU. What should they be doing, or what do you expect, from these countries from now until possibly, the AU meets again in 2023 on this particular matter? If you could unmute your mic, please, Naeem.
I didn't mute it, so I don't know. Okay, there we go. Someone muted me. Okay, in my response, I want to clarify a few things. The first one, in direct response to your question, is the idea that this is now delayed until 2023 summit is part of the Israeli Hasbara. There was no time frame set by the AU, either in the morning meeting or in the afternoon. So theoretically, that committee could meet today and come up with recommendations at the end of this week, and a decision could be made sooner than 2023. Secondly, I must say that we must include in the countries that are most forthright on this issue, Namibia as the fourth one. South Africa, Algeria, Nigeria, and Namibia have been the most vociferous on this. What avenues are available to these countries in the next days, weeks, months, etc.? Mainly right now, frankly, it's what is going to happen in the committee. And so the issue is how the committee is going to be moved, how the committee, members of the committee might be lobbied. And as I said earlier, it's a 3 versus 3 on the committee. So it's Nigeria, Algeria, and South Africa on the side that's calling for the July decision to be revoked. The DRC, Rwanda, and Cameroon on the side that wants to uphold Israel's accreditation. And Macky Sall, because in his capacity as chair of the AU, he's the 7th person. So it's going to really depend on the discussions that take place there. I don't know that outside of that committee there is much that can be done until the next heads of state summit discusses it. Or until there's some kind of discussion at the heads of state level, not necessarily at the next summit. Then heads of other states can be pushed. But for now, it's up to the committee. 2 other things I want to suggest a clarification on, Inayat. One is that I know that the common kind of usage of the terminology is that Israel has been granted observer status. The non-African states do not get observer status to the AU. They get accreditation to the AU. Technically, it's not observer status. Practically, there isn't too much of a difference, slight difference between the two, but technically, it's not observer status, it's accreditation. Secondly, that frankly, I really, as an African, appreciate greatly the work done by Stanley and the other lawyers, etc. But the African Commission on Human and People's Rights does not have jurisdiction over this. They have very specific mandates. They deal with complaints by citizens of African member states against their governments, which issues have not been addressed properly by the courts and authorities in those countries. And so they serve as a kind of higher level body of complaint. You cannot take to the African Commission on People's and Human and People's Rights complaints against states that are not member states. You cannot also take to them complaints against the AU, the chair of the AU Commission, or the AU Heads of States Summit, or the AU Executive Council. It just does not have the jurisdiction to deal with that, unfortunately. And so, you know, I mean, I think that this just needs a bit of clarity moving forward.
Yes. Well, if I could briefly respond to that, just one point. There is an exception, and there have been several decisions that talks about NGOs that have been recognized by the African Union do have standing to seek advisory opinions. And that was the pathway that we used to bring the action, because at least one of the clients in this particular case is an NGO that has been recognized in the past. Now, is it dispositive? No, but it opened the door as far as we were concerned, and we have not received a decision from the Commission saying we don't have jurisdiction over your matter on the basis of the grounds that you set forth.
Thank you, Brother Stanley. Aisha, just looking at from now until 2023 and Israel, and this is where the huge risk is, and this is where the danger is, where Israel could cement its position on the African continent and whatever agenda Israel has in terms of they'd like to play out. Because this is clear from the Israeli Foreign Ministry as well, and saying that they want to facilitate increased cooperation between Israel and the African countries. And clearly there is a danger from now until that summit in 2023 in terms of Israel featuring more prominently and influencing many African nations.
Yes, I think there's a danger, but there's also an opportunity. There's the very real danger that you've outlined that Naeem has spoken to as well. But I do believe there is an opportunity as well, because unlike Naeem, I don't believe that that commission that was set up last weekend could deliberate and come to a decision today. Part of its mandate, as I understand it, is to actually poll the member states of the African Union to seek consensus from the member states on this issue. And that's something that does take time and it does take effort. Whether we're going to see the political will on the part of the members of the committee and on the part of the other states within the union to actually stand by the foundational principles and core values of the union is another matter entirely. So I don't think it need take until 2023, but as Naeem said, there hasn't been a deadline, but I do believe that there is time in which a great risk, a great danger exists of Israel cementing its relations with various key African states and perhaps infiltrating others as well. And I use that word very knowingly and consciously because it does infiltrate. So there is that danger. On the other hand, there is also an opportunity to seek support for the South African, Algerian, Nigerian, and Namibian position in the sense that it is truly oppositional, antithetical to the core values of the union, and that it is an issue that will ultimately split the union, and on that basis to seek support from the other member states and hopefully gain that support before the next heads of state meeting.
Yes, Naeem, just looking at outside of Africa and the reaction to this decision, where there is a report about the Arab Parliament, which is the legislative branch of the Arab League, welcoming this decision. And that is just one example. And the second issue is what does this actually mean for the Palestinian people?
Inayat, there's been a lot of confusion around what happened on Sunday, and the confusion continues. Part of the confusion is because after the decision was taken on Sunday morning, Firstly, I mean, even our foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, gave an interview where she said this was the decision. There'll be a committee formed, and the decision of July last year will be suspended until the committee resolves. She gave an interview saying that before lunch. The Algerians put out a lot of PR around this, and so a lot of the Arab media picked that up from the morning, which said exactly the same thing, that basically, this Israel's accreditation has been suspended. That then got moved over, and despite the debate on Sunday afternoon, a lot of the Arab media continued to run with that. Some of the media even correctly said the debate has been suspended, but then interpreted that to mean that the accreditation has been suspended. So I think there's been a lot of confusion around this, and in many of the, I mean, I've spent the past couple of days writing to a number of media to say you've got the story wrong, because this is not what happened, and this and that is what you need to look at. What it means for the Palestinians, look, it directly, I would say not too much. Okay, in the next few months and in next year, whatever. The fact that Israel is accredited to the AU is not going to give the, not going to make the Palestinian situation any better or any worse directly. However, what it does mean and what it does indicate is that Israel has been able to break or potentially break the African bloc in terms of how it votes in multilateral fora. This was one of the big objectives of Israel, because the African continent usually went to the UN General Assembly, for example, and voted as a bloc on issues. So if you had a resolution in the GA condemning Israeli settlements, you knew that there would be 54 votes from Africa that would support that resolution. This even though a number of individual states had very close relations with Israel. Insinuating Israel now into the African Union as an accredited non-African state, whether this will succeed in breaking that block on these issues remains to be seen, but potentially it could, because the Israel supporting states in the African Union can now argue in the prelude to such discussions at the GA, for example, that the AU has accepted Israel as or has accredited Israel to the AU. And therefore, it's not correct that they vote in that kind of way. And this potentially, not only at the GA, but at the Human Rights Council and other places, could be a problem, could break the vote in support of the Palestinian cause, the vote that opposes Israel's human rights violations, crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And so at that level, this could pose quite a significant problem moving forward. I can see, for example, that when the debate comes up later this year at the General Assembly about apartheid and whether Israel should be regarded as an apartheid state, that the African continent will not be united behind that, unfortunately, and this then would be a victory for Israel.
Yes, Stanley. Just looking at organizations like, for instance, I cited the example of the MRN, but also NGOs and within some of these member states and their role in terms of lobbying their own governments on this matter, together with people like yourselves, with legal people, and also other people, activists, social activists, and just understanding what role organizations like NGOs and yourself can play in lobbying governments and putting the required pressure.
Well, there's two separate points. Let me first add the proverbial 800-pound gorilla in the room. Given Israel's indifference to human rights, given Israel's indifference to international law, given Israel's indifference to its correct description as a war criminal, as an apartheid state, Israel cannot sit still. It will end up in the discussion that we're talking about over the next few weeks, months, or year. It will continue to tell the world to leave it alone. It'll continue to assassinate. It will continue to attack. It will continue to steal land. So ultimately, it will escalate and make the pressure brought to bear upon this discussion in Africa more complicated and more difficult. Now, in terms of your question, organizations, NGOs can continue to challenge Israel in jurisdictions that are called jurisdictions of universal jurisdiction, where you can bring litigation and lawsuits against Israel on various grounds. There are suits pending in the United States against Israel right now. I suspect there are others that will be coming up. There is discovery that takes place with this. There's litigation that takes place with this. It makes it more difficult for Israeli government representatives, be they in the military or elected or quasi-civilian, to visit lest they be served with subpoenas. So what we will continue to do is to bring actions wherever we can, wherever we find violations that are recognizable under universal jurisdiction. South Africa has universal jurisdiction. Other states have universal jurisdiction. And the more actions we bring, and the more the light of air shines upon Israeli violence and violation of human rights and international law, in theory, whether it's the representatives of the African Union or whether it's the representatives of other governments, it becomes increasingly more difficult, if not a breakpoint of impossibility, to ignore what you confront. There's a big discussion going on right now in the United States over the most recent murder of a Palestinian American citizen by Israeli soldiers on the ground. There is a big discussion going on right now over Amnesty International. And while I'm not suggesting that the Zionist lobby will not to some degree rewrite it and to some degree prevail, these discussions generate and build solidarity all over the world.
Thank you for that, Stanley. Naim, just looking at us locally in South Africa now, we've got a number of Palestinian organizations that support the Palestinian cause. We've seen the PSA issue a statement saying that we, as South Africans living in a member state of the AU, deem it our duty to combat and object to the AU's decision in granting Israel observer status, and this came through from the PSA. And just looking at the various Palestine organizations within South Africa, and I suppose, in forming basically a lobby groups as well, and making sure that all round, they would keep up or maintain the pressure, and would that possibly be an option as well?
No, absolutely. Look, on this particular issue at the African Union, the South African BDS coalition, of which the PSA is an affiliate, as is the PSC and various other groups, South African Jews for Free Palestine, for example. The SABDS coalition has been in discussion over the past, since July last year, with officials in Dirko. So the kind of I should say on this issue, civil society didn't have to pressure the South African government, but had to coordinate with the South African government because they were quite strong on the issue already. But beyond South Africa, I mean, there's been a new development that took place just before the July decision, around March last year, which was the formation of a continental body called the Pan-African-Palestine Solidarity Network. And this has been very useful, particularly after the July decision by Moussa Faki, in coordinating the lobbying work across the continent. The PAPSN, as it's called, has members, for example, in Namibia, Botswana, Kenya, Senegal. Its first in-person meeting conference is going to take place next month in Senegal. And hopefully that can help to put some pressure on Macky Sall, whatever the case might be, but it's in Senegal. It has members in Morocco. So PAPSN, the Pan-African-Palestine Solidarity Network, I think over the past year is the most significant civil society development on the African continent in terms of Palestinian solidarity. The South African member of PAPSN is the SABDS coalition, which, as I said, includes all of these various members. And that has been strategizing. I mean, right now, I think that the PAPSN statement, on Sunday's events is probably the clearest account of events in writing. We have a number of interviews, etc., but in writing, probably the clearest about what actually happened. Papson was also able to give virtually real-time a report of what was happening in the debate, in the closed debate, I should say, that took place on Sunday afternoon. And that really, in terms of civil society action moving forward, I think is very important. And its relationship in different countries with Palestinian embassies, its relationship with other Palestinian movements and both civil society and political, and in some countries, its relationship with its own governments, like in South Africa. I think moving forward, this kind of coordinated action between friendly governments and the Pan-African Solidarity Network would be very important.
Shukran for that, Aisha. I see you back with us, and we are going to run slightly over. We're going to overrun on our time. We were due to finish at 8, but Aisha, just looking at final thoughts, I'm going to go around the panel, and perhaps anything else you wish to add.
Well, I think Naeem's made a very, very important point about the formation of the Pan-African Solidarity, Palestine Solidarity Network. But I think also importantly that around the globe, people are no longer as ignorant about what is going on in Palestine as they were, say, 10, even 5 years ago. So there is a groundswell of citizen agitation, citizen solidarity with the Palestinian cause that didn't exist to this degree around the world, which is in itself a very useful tool for lobbying governments at the domestic level by their own people, but also for forming alliances and putting pressure on, for example, member states of the African Union that might otherwise concede to the need to appease not only Israel, but some of its major allies, such as the United States.
Well, shukran for that. Stanley, final thoughts.
Yeah, in line with what my sister just said, in the United States, for example, increasingly there's this desperate effort by the ADL, by AIPAC, and other organizations to silence BDS, to punish academics. And while in the first instance it appeared to have some groundwork, it's collapsing now. Increasingly, the anti-BDS legislation is being struck down by our constitutional courts. Academia is playing a more active role. Mensa, the national organization, is about to issue a pro-BDS statement. So I agree that I've been involved in litigation around Palestine since 1995. And the voices that we hear in the world, the voices that we hear in public today are dramatically longer and larger and more to the point today than 95, than 2000, 2005, 2010. It's a growing movement. It's an expanding movement, and I am optimistic.
Thank you for that, Naeem. We'll let you have the last word.
Sure. I think, look, moving forward, of course, globally, but certainly our discussion about the African continent is that these various different strands really need to be pulled together. I mean, the kind of amazing work that Stanley and his legal colleagues are doing on these issues is a very important part of the struggle. And some of his colleagues in the US, I know, who are have done sterling work around the IHRE definition of anti-Semitism, for example. All of that needs to be brought to bear on the African continent as well. Similarly, the civil society network, the Pan-African Solidarity Network, for example, friendly governments, Palestinian organizations, and even embassies. I think that the battle is large enough that it requires a kind of coordinated work by all of these in their different areas of speciality to take it forward. I do believe that there is a chance that the July decision can be overturned. It requires a lot more work by all of these sectors, as I said, including the legal sector. We can convince the committee to move in a particular direction. But yes, if we sit back and relax, it's not going to happen. Lots more work needs to be done.
Well, to all of you, to Stanley Cohen, Naim, Gina, Aisha Keji, we thank you. We do appreciate you taking time out on this panel discussion on this Wednesday evening here on Salam Media. We wish you all the best and please take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Masalam.
Walaikum salam.
Wa alaikum.
Well, that was part one of this evening's discussion on Wednesday night with myself, Inayat Wadi. We're going to go for a break. And in a few minutes, we are going to be focusing on the Tulsi twins. And the question we are raising is we know that the Tulsi twins were convicted on terror charges, and we are obviously questioning the plea bargain. So, to unpack that, we've got quite an interesting panel once again. We'll be joined by Dr. Ahmed Jazbai and also Hanif Hendricks, the leader of the Al Jama political party. Stay with us. We're going to go for a break.